morning, church. It's great to be with you again on Sunday morning. Today's lesson is entitled Sale of the Century. We're going to continue in our study on the epic battles found in the Bible. And there's so many epic battles. There's so many of them that we can read about. And I've only chosen a few, just a handful. I just picked a few here. But the amazing thing about all these epic battles in the Bible is that each time God himself intervenes in order to rescue his people, sometimes from insurmountable odds. And as soon as God steps into the ring, you can put money down on who the winner is going to be. The first epic battle, if you remember, we looked at was Exodus. God rescued an entire nation out of slavery because of a promise of love that God made to one of their ancestors. And we saw the foreshadowing of Jesus and how God is willing to rescue us from our slavery of sin because he made a promise of love to each one of us. Next, we looked at Deborah. In the story of Deborah, the people of Israel had again and again chosen to reject God. And yet, he got down into the mud to rescue his people from oppression. And he showed us that it's not about a sin cycle, more so than a redemption cycle, and that God is on center stage in all of our stories. It's not us in our sin, it's God. Last week, if you remember, we looked at King David. King David was a guy after God's own heart. And God, through this young man, dare I say, a teenager, brought an entire army to its knees. All three of these stories show God is the warrior, and he fights for each one of us. And each of these stories foreshadow the greatest epic battle of all time. We're going to look at that battle of Jesus on Easter weekend. Today we're going to look at a guy in the Old Testament by the name of Joseph. And to show how this fits into our lives, we need to give this story a little bit of context. So follow along with me. The first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, they give us a very brief bird's eye view, extended view of the creation narrative. It kind of takes that view from the outside, and it shows how mankind fits into God's creation story. These chapters, they span a period of about a couple thousand years, I think. Around a couple thousand years. It's not a theological debate here, but from a human perspective, a couple thousand years. The next 39 chapters of Genesis, they narrow things in, they target things in, they bring the focus back down to this certain family, starting with a guy named Abram or Abraham. And Genesis ends with the story of Joseph in the country of Egypt. So this narrowed section spans about 300 years. So instead of a couple thousand, we bring it down to 300 years. So follow along. We have the creation story, Adam and Eve. Everyone knows the story of Adam and Eve, right? That story didn't turn out so good for us, did it? Then we had Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel were the children, the two brothers of Adam and Eve. Again, what happens? Not so good for us. Cain kills Abel, two brothers. Wow. So we start to see, just right from the beginning, this reoccurring story that mankind chooses to reject God. The results are always pretty similar. Up until we run into this guy named Abram or Abraham. He seems to be a little bit different. He's far from perfect, trust me. But this guy Abraham, he trusts God and God's story. So now we get the context. Okay, let's jump into Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 3. It reads, "The Lord had said to Abraham, 'Go from your country, your people and your father's household, to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All people on earth will be blessed through you.'" So this is the promise, guys. This is the promise to Abraham. God is going to set Abraham up as the father of nations. All nations will be blessed through him. Not only is Israel, the nation of Abraham, from the seed or the line of Abraham. But did you know that Islam itself can trace some of its roots back to Abraham? Christianity also traces its spiritual roots back to Abraham. It was prophesied that eventually a king would come, that all nations would be saved through Abraham. And a king would come from this one guy, and he's going to fight the most epic battle to set us free from slavery. So God makes a promise to Abraham about his descendants. But not only does he make a promise, he also makes a covenant with Abraham. So that's what we're going to read in verse 12 to 18 of chapter 15. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick, dreadful darkness came over him. The Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." So Abraham, he trusted God and God's story. And he goes off and he moves to the land that was promised to him. He's promised all this land. And guess what he does? He goes into the land and he sets up tents. Tents? Why would you set up tents? God just gave me all this land. So it reminds me of this passage in Hebrews, doesn't it? In chapter 11, verse 8 to 10. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as an inheritance, obeyed and went. Even though he did not know where he was going, by faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So Abraham wanted to be with God. Can you see foreshadowing here, guys? We live our entire lives trying to build our home, our castle, our fortune, but shouldn't we be trying to prepare our future home with God? Abraham lived as a sojourner on this earth. Shouldn't we be doing the same thing? The early Christians, they had this on straight. Take a look here in what it says in Acts in the first century church. Verse 21 to 22 reads, "They preached the gospel in that city and they won a large number of disciples. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God," they said. It is not easy to become a Christian, is it? And sometimes it's difficult to continue on that path. Because, frankly, this world pushes on us every day a lifestyle contrary to the message of God in the Bible. I'll give you an example. I just watched the Grammys last week with Lisa. Popular culture is not really in line with God and His Word. The great thing about living life as a Christian is we have examples of people who went on ahead of us, and the path for us is already marked out. We don't have to beat down the brush and make a new path because people went that way before us. It's not going to be easy, but it's not going to be impossible either. So Abraham is told, back to Abraham, he's told that for 400 years, his family will be in another country. They'll be mistreated there. Does that remind you of another story? Yeah, that's right. That's the Exodus story. So now we're going to see how God was leading the people up to the Exodus story. And again, God is leading the people to something great. I entitled this message, "The Sale of the Century," because some of you might remember it's an old syndicated TV game show. Most of the younger generation won't remember this at all. They won't know about it. The Sale of the Century consisted of a bunch of contestants answering general knowledge questions. And at certain points during the game show, the player that was currently in the lead would be offered it's called an instant bargain. It was a prize that they could keep regardless of the game's outcome, but they'd have to exchange some of the money that they'd already won. And it would be deducted from their score. So let's continue. Sale of the century. Abraham, he has his first son. His name is Isaac. And then Isaac has Jacob as his son. Jacob had another brother, but the storyline follows Jacob. Jacob, in turn, has 12 sons. And the second to the last of those 12 is named Joseph. Now we're going to pick it up in Genesis 37. That's talking about Joseph. He's probably about 17 years old at this point. The Bible describes Joseph as the favorite child of Jacob. I guarantee you that's not going to make things simple when you have 11 other brothers. Not a chance. So Joseph is a special. And I can't say for sure. I can't say what the dynamics of this family were like. It's a special read. Jacob is a special read. It's a great story, but it's a little more dysfunctional for my taste. And I imagine that Joseph was a little special as well. Kind of took after his dad. You get the impression, and this is conjecture on my part, that the other kids did all or most of the work. That Joseph was a little bit protected. He was a mama and daddy's boy. He was protected by mom and dad. So we see Joseph, also he has a gift of speaking his mind. You all probably know someone like that in your family. Someone who speaks their mind with little or no tact. So much so that Joseph, the brothers of Joseph, they get ticked off with their brother. Maybe, I don't know, I read into this a little bit, but maybe he was a little bit of a tattletale. That's not going to mix well with 11 other brothers. Maybe the boys, they just wanted their father's affection. I don't know. But at one point in the story, Joseph goes to his brothers and he says, okay guys, I had a dream. And guess what? All you guys are going to bow down to me. That's a little bit blow your mind, no? Another time he goes, I know I said all of you are going to bow down to me, but it's actually going to be all of you and mom and dad are going to bow down to me. I don't read in the story that Joseph was an instigator. I get the feeling he was just a big mouth. So let's pick it up and we get the response of his brothers. In Genesis chapter 37, verse 19 to 20, it reads, "Oh, here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come on now, let's kill him, throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." These guys were going to show Joseph what they thought of his dreams, weren't they? They're thinking to themselves, he wants to rule over us? Well, I'll show him. Let's kill him. Wow. Thank goodness, and luckily, the older brother convinces them not to kill Joseph, but they throw him into a cistern. Let's see what happens here next. In verse 25, it says, "As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt to sell. Judah said to his brothers, 'What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on now, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let's not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother. He is our flesh and blood.' His brothers agree, and so when the Midianite merchants come up, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver. They in turn took him down to Egypt for sale into slavery." Can you imagine that? These guys say, "We're going to show you, boy." They sell Joseph and he gets sold into slavery in Egypt. He gets sold to the captain of the guard, the Bible teaches. The captain of Pharaoh's guard. Joseph's brothers, they didn't think much of this young punk and his dreams, did they? And I can almost guarantee you that the brothers were thinking, those dreams are done with. So Joseph, let's pick it up again. Joseph is in Egypt. He becomes very effective in what he does. He's so effective, so much so that he raises up the ranks and he starts to manage everything for the captain of the guard. He manages everything except what the guy ate. The captain delegated all his responsibilities because Joseph was so competent in what he was doing. You might be thinking now, whoa, maybe dreams do come true. Maybe these guys' dreams can come true. I don't know. Then we get a little bit of a hiccup again. So we're going to pick up the story in Genesis 39 and follow along, will you? Joseph was well built, verse 7 and 9. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to me and my care. No one is greater in this house except I am. And my master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" What an amazing response here. It's almost as if this response was rehearsed. It was so eloquent. It was so on point. And you could even think, man, this guy, Joseph and God, they're like this. How can anything go wrong for Joseph? Him and God were so tight, nothing could go wrong. Aren't there times in our lives, in our Christian's walks, when we can go through challenges and think, well, hold on a second. I am so close to God right now, nothing can go wrong for me. That's the funny thing about life. It has this habit of throwing curveballs when we're not expecting it, doesn't it? We go to the doctor maybe for a routine checkup and, what? I've got cancer? We're at home with our spouse and all of a sudden, a huge fight in our marriage. Maybe you're sitting at dinner with your family and one of the kids drops a bombshell in the middle of the dinner table. What is our first response when something like that happens? Why me, God? Why me? Don't we question? Don't we respond like that? How can you imagine Joseph in this story? Let's pick it up in verse 11 of Joseph's story. One day he went to the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he left his cloak in her hand, had run out of the house, she called her household servants. Look, she said to them, "this Hebrew who has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed, and when he heard my scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until the master came home. Then she told him this story. "The Hebrew slave you brought home to me came to make sport of me, and as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When the master heard the story, his wife was saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Wow, how do those dreams of Joseph look now? He's in prison, and he's innocent. Do you think Joseph was thinking, why me, God? I stood up for you, God. I stood up for you when no one was watching. And here I am in prison. This is not right. It's not supposed to happen like that. But for Joseph, can you imagine those thoughts? My own brothers sold me into slavery because of, I don't know, jealousy. I'm thrown in prison for rape, and I'm innocent. Church, it is easy for me, no, it's easier for me to suffer consequences of an action that I've committed that is wrong. But if I do everything right, everything I should have, and things still don't go bad, that's called injustice. And we've been told by our Western Christian tradition that if I do the right thing all the time, everything will go well for me. It just doesn't work like that. If it's not going well, some of us, dare I say, may give up on God. God, church, is not an investment plan with little risk and a stable return. Christianity and the prosperity gospel is a lie. With God, the return is enormous. Trust me, the return is enormous. But we need to give up, we need to hold on for the ride. The return is enormous, but the ride is like a roller coaster. That's why when we look to Joseph, he didn't give up. Joseph persevered. That's the bigger battle in our lives too. We can't give up in spite of incredible difficulties. Joseph, he didn't take the instant bargain that was offered him. Lesser men would quit. They might think, well, God hasn't blessed me, therefore I'm not going to continue. Joseph never gave up. He spends the next few years in prison and still doesn't give up. He helps two guys out. One of them gets executed, the other gets set free and works at the Pharaoh's table. And that guy forgets about Joseph's help. But it's amazing, due to a series of events, Joseph ends up getting brought before Pharaoh to interpret, you got it right, a dream of the future. So in this dream that Pharaoh has, Joseph interprets the dream. He says, for the next 7 years, Egypt is going to have incredible wealth, an incredible 7 years of great time. Following that 7 years is going to be an incredible time of bust, famine, and disaster for the country. It's going to be so bad for that 7 years that people won't remember the good times. Kind of like, I don't know, maybe the oil boom in Alberta. We forget the boom times when we hit the bust times. Joseph advises the Pharaoh. He says, okay, here's what we need to do. During the good times, the good harvest, we need to put aside 20% every year as a storage reserve, just to protect our country. You don't want people to starve. 20%. Let's save 20% for the hard times. That's not our society today, is it? Do you believe, I looked this up, Canada is ranked in the top 10 of the most indebted households in the world? We have more debt per capita in Canada than the United States does. Maybe we should follow Joseph's advice with finances too. Just maybe. But back to the story. Okay, he gets promoted. Because of his wise advice to Pharaoh, he gets promoted to the number 2 guy. Number 2 in all of Egypt. Joseph manages the great boom of the first 7 years. And guess what? The famine hits. And the famine is not just Egypt. It's the entire Middle East, the known world of the day, all around the Mediterranean Sea. So Joseph's brothers, Jacob's other sons, they hear about what Egypt is doing. Egypt's got grain to sell. They're also in a famine. So Jacob says to the boys, the 11, he says, okay, go down to Egypt and buy grain so that we will survive and not die. They go down and they don't recognize Joseph. They've probably forgotten about what they'd done. Well, no, they didn't forget, but they don't recognize Joseph because time has passed. What do? This is really neat, guys. They go before Joseph to buy grain. The first thing they do, out of respect, is they bow down to Joseph. Joseph's dreams came true. Do you see that? His dreams came true. But man, was it ever a hard road. This is funny because a lot of times we don't see our dreams fulfilled because the road's too difficult. And some of us give up. I celebrated just last week. I didn't even celebrate, but my anniversary of the day I got baptized was last week. 28 years. 28 years ago I was baptized. I had dreams, you guys. I had a lot of dreams. Now I've been married to an amazing, faithful woman of God for coming up on 27 years now. I have 3 amazing children, and all 3 are faithful to the Lord and happy. I have the best job I think I could ever imagine. But I can tell you one thing, it has been far from easy. We've had to deal with major sickness in our family. We've had to deal with death in our family. loss of wealth, huge upheaval and change. Life for the Stringer family has not been a steady, risk-free investment. It's been very challenging. I think about the Christiansons, Colin and Melissa, and their 3 kids. Colin, a few years back, suffered from flesh-eating disease and was close to death. They went through financial upheaval with their family. Corbin almost died in their garage when he was a young kid. But after 25 some years, faithful to God, Colin and Melissa still have incredible smiles. That's amazing. I don't know what's going to happen in Edmonton over the next few years. We've all got stories, but I know this. It's not going to be a walk in the park. It's not going to be easy. And if it is a walk in the park, I would question if we're on the right path. Because remember, you guys, we're all sojourners on this world. We all have stories, we all have hardships, and we all have trials. But like Paul says, we will go through many hardships. God worked through the incredible sin of jealousy, slave trading, accusation of rape, remarkable deceit to bring about the salvation of Israel. These brothers, you can imagine, were shaking in their boots. But listen to what Joseph says. Verse 7 of chapter 45. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Wow. Can you imagine if it was you or me in Joseph's shoes? I'd probably think, boy, I'm going to teach you guys a lesson. Do you remember when you sold me into slavery when I was 17? You might be thinking to yourself even right now, well, it's not supposed to happen that way. My question to you is, how do we know how it's supposed to happen? Let's continue to read Genesis chapter 50, verse 19 to 20. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. God never lost control. Regardless of how haywire life seems, God is in control. This is God's intention for all of us. God didn't use the sin to bring about the salvation. God knew exactly what man was going to do. He just never lost control. Just like when Jesus is on the cross, he never lost control. He didn't use our sin, but he knew exactly what would happen. He never lost control. What mankind intends for evil, God intends for the saving of many lives. God, through sin, suffering, and rejection, God brought about the redemption of many lives. Do you see Joseph's spiritual mentality here? He was rejected, suffered, and because of other people's sin, he was without fault. And yet through that guy, God brought about salvation. Does that sound familiar to you? You bet it does. God intends all things for his glory. Now think about this. In spite of people's sin, God can do amazing things. Imagine what God can do when people are righteous. But think about this. If you don't believe in providence, I don't know what to say. But think about this. Had Joseph taken the instant bargain and not been able to be used in the way that he was, Jacob, the tribe of Jacob, would not have continued. There would have been no exodus from Egypt. There would have been no nation of Israel. There would have been no kingdom of Judah, no line of Judah, no Jesus to die on a cross and ultimately no salvation for you and for me. If that's not God's providence, I don't know what is. Had Joseph opted for the instant bargain, we all lose. This story is not about Joseph. This epic battle is about God. Whatever happens, God is in control. Do you believe that really? Like, really believe it? You guys, we are on a fantastic journey called life. And along the way, those instant bargains will be offered. But remember, God is working through you and your life. So let's finish to remind us, before we take communion, one last passage to help us focus our minds on God and how He is in control. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. I'm going to read that again. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Church, the life that we live is not easy. I can't tell you why things happen the way that they do, but all I can say is God is in control. As we take communion, let's remember that God is in control, that He brought all these things about. Even the death of His Son Jesus on the cross, He never lost control, and He brought it all together so that we can have a relationship with Him. Let's pray now. Father, thank You so much for this time to remember and to reflect on the sacrifice of Jesus, the blood that was shed for the forgiveness of all of our sins, to set us free from the slavery of sin, and to help us live a new life and a new family in the church. Thank You for Your Son Jesus, in His name. Amen.